Hello, and thanks once again, everyone, for joining us for Sunday's edition of Alaska Weather, 23rd day of October. And up first on, I believe, Hazardous Weather Graphic, there's several zones there that are under the influence of a winter storm watch that goes into effect late Monday night and continues through late Tuesday night. And that's for possible heavy snow for the Yukon Delta, about 7 to 10 inches possible, and then that kind of increases a little bit there, and you get into the northern Kuskokwim Valley, McGrath-Nikolai area, possibly 8 to 12 inches of snow in that 24-hour period. And then out toward the coast, winds will be gusting to about 45 miles an hour or so that'll create areas of blowing snow and lower visibilities if the temperatures stay low enough. And for the next year, taking a little closer look at the winter storm watch. Again, it's for heavy snow, 8 to 12 inches possible, heaviest over those eastern areas there, and a little bit lighter out toward the coastline. And again, for the Yukon Delta, lower Yukon Valley, and upper Kuskokwim Valley. And again, the period time goes into effect early Tuesday morning through 6 a.m. Wednesday. And plan on difficult travel conditions in those areas. You can see the blue shaded area there on the map on the right is where the watch is for. So Amanek, Hooper Bay, Anvik, over toward McGrath, Nikolai, and all those areas in between. And reduced visibility at times, as I mentioned, for blowing snow with those winds gusting as high as 45 miles per hour, maybe 50 miles an hour along the Yukon Delta coast. And from there, taking a look at satellite imagery, you've got a weakening system moving across the southern panhandle there, the front into British Columbia and past the Queen Charlottes, and then the low center now tracking in toward the coastline with bringing rain and wind to the entire panhandle, with the heaviest wind and rain over the southern areas, anywhere from half an inch to an inch falling there, much lighter amounts up to the north, and pretty gusty winds along the coastal areas as well. And then a break behind that, just some clouds there over the Copper River Basin, and then some areas of flurries and fog, low clouds, Northway, eastern Copper River Basin up into the Fairbanks area, and actually up into the Yukon Flats as well. And mostly sunny skies, south central Alaska, after the mid and high level clouds broke out earlier, and which really wasn't amounted to that much, but clear skies this afternoon, light winds, Kodiak Island, northeast Bristol Bay, right up into south central Alaska. And then the next weak system tracking onto the coast there with some snow and rain along the coast, and another system up toward the Bering Strait, and south winds there bringing rain to the south coast of the Seward Peninsula with some rain and snow, or just snow over the northern areas there, or the inland areas of the Seward Peninsula. And then some more clouds out over the Aleutians, kind of with the frontal boundary there extending back to the next system. It's just coming onto the chart, cirrus shield associated with that, west-southwest of Shimia. And rolling that through again, you can see how that front's breaking up as it crosses eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, holding together a little bit better out toward Atka and Adak, and links up with the next system, kind of a warm front there, up across just southwest of Shimia. On the chart today, you can see that frontal boundary nearly right along the Aleutian chain there into that low center, 1,005 millibars low. They're weaker than the 998 millibar low, now coming onto the southwest coast. And then the strongest storm actually now weakening with about the same pressure there, but a tighter pressure gradient around it. That brought 50 to 55 mile an hour wind gusts to the coastal areas of the Panhandle, Cape Decision, those normally windier areas there, with anywhere from a half inch to an inch of rain falling today in a 12-hour period ending at 3 p.m. over the southern Panhandle. Much lighter amounts up to the north. I believe Petersburg maybe a quarter of an inch, and then just a few hundredths of an inch around Juneau. And dry for the North Gulf Coast, and then that lingering snow shower, snow flurry condition for the eastern Copper River Basin, especially to the northeast there, and up in across the Tanana Valley, western Alaska, or the Alaska Range, in the Yukon Flats there. Even Bettles had some light snow earlier today, but basically dry along the Arctic coast. Then a couple of low centers there are actually the weaker one near the Bering Strait, that bringing rain in across the southern Seward Peninsula. Nome picked up about 1/4 of an inch today, and inland areas seeing that as snow, maybe 1 to 2 inches falling. And some of that will spread into Bristol Bay, starting out as snow, but starting to change to rain for tonight. Could see a few inches of snow over Bristol Bay this evening, overnight tonight. Kind of a mixed precipitation pattern there. With the definitely to the north, it'll be in the form of snow. Kuskokwim River Valley in the Delta on up into the Yukon River, and all the way up to Kobuk Valley, periods of snow. Back to the Noatak Valley tonight, light snow, maybe 1 to 2 inches possible. Dry over the central interior for the most part. Still some lingering light snow that won't amount to too much over the Wrangell Mountains, northeast Copper River Basin area, eastern Alaska Range. Otherwise pretty dry with mostly clear skies. That low tracking into Kamishak Bay will increase the clouds over southern Cook Inlet, but most of the moisture staying south of the Kenai Peninsula. Port Muller may pick some light precipitation up, but it won't amount to much. And that low tracking eastward there, almost right across Dixon Entrance now, kind of taking off to the east-southeast. So drying out from northwest to southeast there, rain changing to showers, but lasting the entire night there over the southern Panhandle. Then the next system, warm front rain spread into the Pribilofs, eastern Aleutians, and rain and increasing wind there over the west central Aleutian areas. And for the day on Monday, that warm front continues to push northeastward, but doesn't make too much headway. Most of the rainfall now exiting the eastern Aleutians, some light rain, fog, and drizzle into the Alaska Peninsula and Pribilofs, and pretty gusty southwest winds from about Adak westward to Amchitka, then lightening up behind the front over Shimei and Attu, but rain across all the western Aleutians, southwest Bering Sea. And mostly cloudy for the southwest coast, and then a weak trough kicking northeastward and eastward could bring some light snow showers into the Kuskokwim Valley tomorrow, maybe reaching the western Alaska Range, but again, that's quite light and won't really amount to too much in the way of any accumulation. Maybe seeing a ½ inch or so, maybe an inch, southern slopes of the western Brooks Range, up back toward that 1,007 millibar low over the Chukchi Sea. Otherwise, central and eastern interior, light winds, dry conditions, variably cloudy skies to mostly sunny. Copper River Basin, south central Alaska, that low moving eastward brings an increasing chance of rain to the coast of the Panhandle tomorrow, with the rain and snow showers tending to move out of the area earlier on. And then for the day on Tuesday, that low center tracks eastward and deepens to 972 millibars. So we've got gale and storm force winds all around that center. Coming inland, big push of warm air up into the southwest interior, freezing levels rising up to 2,000 feet over the Yukon Delta, and maybe 4,000 feet over Bristol Bay. So there'll be a snow changing to rain pattern there, especially behind the front, warm front, rain, Kodiak Island, tightening gradient along the western Alaska Range, and to a lesser extent across south central Alaska, the Kenai Peninsula. So southeast winds on the increase. That's going to bring warmer air in with it. So a mix of precipitation changing toward rain to the south, and then some snow. Northern Susitna Valley, McKinley Park, back to the northwest toward the Kobuk Valley, Kotzebue Sound, and those areas. Stays dry with light winds over the northern Brooks Range out to the Arctic coast, Tanana Valley, Yukon Flats down to the Copper River Basin. Some showers over the southern Panhandle, otherwise partly to maybe mostly sunny, but definitely dry with light winds over the northern half of the southeast coast. Rain doesn't arrive at Yakutat until Tuesday evening. And for the lows tonight, 30s to near 40 for the Panhandle, anywhere from 5 above to 15 above for the Copper River Basin, in the teens for the Susitna Valley, lower 20s south central Alaska, Kuskokwim Valley, 30 to 35 for Bristol Bay, mid-30s Kodiak Island, highs tomorrow in the 40s, and highs only in the teens for the Copper River Basin, 30 to 35 Susitna, Manuska Valley into the Kenai Peninsula, closer to 40 down towards Seward and Homer, upper 40s Kodiak Island, upper 30s, lower 40s for Bristol Bay, lower 30s Kuskokwim Valley. Lows almost to zero there at Gulkana. Some areas may fall below zero to the east, a little above zero to the west. Mid-teens for the Susitna Valley. Teens and lower 20s for south central Alaska. Lower 30s for Bristol Bay. 30s to near 40 for the Panhandle. And the highs on Tuesday, 40s for the southeast coast, teens for the Copper River Basin, 30s for southern Alaska, mid-40s over Bristol Bay and Kodiak Island, near 50 for Chignik. Lows tonight, single numbers for the northeast interior to the Brooks Range, otherwise teens and 20s, followed by highs in the 20s and 30s, but teens for the Brooks Range, 20s for the Arctic coast. Lows either side of zero there over the northeast interior, otherwise mostly in the teens. Warmer out toward the Bering Strait. Highs coldest in the northeast, a little warmer out toward the Bering Strait, above freezing there. 20s central Arctic coast. Out to the southwest, lows tonight pretty mild for the eastern Aleutians, mid to upper 40s, otherwise lower 30s for the southwest coast. Highs near 40 for the southwest coast, mid 50s central Aleutians.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And flying weather for Monday morning, IFR there from Yukon Delta northward, Norton Sound, southern Seward Peninsula, and then on up to the western Brooks Range, covering the Kobuk Valley and just about into Selawik. Marginal VFR for the Arctic coast, mostly VFR over the eastern and central interior, right on down into Kachemak Bay, all of the North Gulf Coast and the northern Panhandle. Marginal VFR southern southeast coast, and then warm front spreading IFR across the Fox Islands to just about False Pass late tonight and extending back to Shimianatu. And for the afternoon, Monday afternoon, IFR reaches the southwest coast and across just about all of the Alaska Peninsula, Pribilofs back to Amchitka Island westward to Shimianatu. A couple areas of IFR over the northwest part of the state, lower Yukon River Valley on up into across the Kobuk Valley to the Brooks Range. Another one there from Shishmaref up to Kivalina, Point Hope, Red Dog, and those areas, Cape Lisburne. North Slope Arctic Coast, VFR, Eastern Interior, VFR, some lingering marginal VFR over the Talkeetnas. Otherwise, South Central Alaska, Kuskokwim Valley, Kodiak, Northeast Bristol Bay, eastward to Yakutat. Pretty good, solid VFR. And then some areas of marginal VFR for the Panhandle. And for the Tuesday morning outlook, big area of IFR into the central and spreading eastern Bering Sea across Bristol Bay into Pilot Point and just about down to Port Hayden. Marginal VFR for the western Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, IFR central Aleutians, and a lot of VFR over the interior. Marginal VFR southern southeast coast. And then for Tuesday afternoon, that area of IFR really pushes eastward and a little bit to the northeast, covering St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound, and much of the southwest interior into the Kuskokwim Valley to the western Alaska Range, and then even east of the mountains there, in across southern Cook Inlet, Kamishak, Kachemak Bay, Kodiak Island, all IFR in the afternoon, but VFR holding northern Cook Inlet and Susitna-Manuska Valley into the Tanana Valley, eastward there to Eagle, a little to the north, some VFR holding over the North Slope and Arctic coast. Eastern North Gulf Coast, Northern Panhandle VFR, Southern Panhandle, also VFR with marginal VFR in between. Passes Anatuvik and Adigan, optimistically going VFR for the day tomorrow. Lake Clark and Merrill, definitely VFR flying through both those passes. Same thing for Rainy and Windy, good VFR flying both south and north entrance. Isabel, open as well, VFR. And Mentasta, VFR. Tonita, same forecast, VFR, looking good just about all of the passes here until we get to Chilkoot and White. Portage, VFR, either approach. Chilkoot and White, looks like it'll be marginal VFR at some point during the day tomorrow and could be VFR at other times. And for the freezing levels at the surface, northward to St. Lawrence Island and just about to the Seward Peninsula, but not quite, and then hugging the Yukon Delta coast, cutting into just north of the coast, Bristol Bay, and just off the North Gulf Coast into the northern Panhandle, 2,000 to 8,000 foot freezing levels across the southern Bering Sea, warmest over the central Aleutians, 2,000 to 4,000 feet over the Panhandle. Icing, mixed icing, light variety, mixed icing above 6,000 feet for the Panhandle. Heavier icing coming into the western Aleutians and isolated moderate rime icing, freezing level to 18,000 feet with a warm front for Bluff Islands and Alaska Peninsula, exiting the eastern Aleutians, and then the heavier icing way out over Amchitka and Kiska Island, considerable moderate there. And the jet stream, 170 knots out of the west, just southwest of Shimei and Attu, but anywhere from 130 to 145 knots blowing across the Bering Sea. Northwest 140 to 145 along the southwest coast, just south of Kodiak Island. 9,000 feet, 50 to 70 knot westerlies, Aleutian, southern Bering Sea, across the Alaska Peninsula, diving south of the Panhandle and the Gulf. And at 3,000 feet, 85 knot southwest winds coming into the western Aleutians. Otherwise, 35 to 40 knots across Kodiak Island, Kamishak Bay, and the Barren Islands, as well as the Aleutian Range. Turbulence, considerable moderate chop, falls past westward to Kiska Island, up over the DeLong Mountains and Kamishak Bay.
We try to provide everyone with the best forecast we can for snow, sleet, and ice in the winter with as much notice as we can. And we've made great strides in our forecasting over the years. However, given the complexity in winter weather forecasting, the first forecast simply won't be as good as the one closer to the event. As the event nears, our forecasts will become more precise.
Forecasts are updated constantly from days before the event until the precipitation actually begins. If you want the most accurate and up-to-date information, you have to check the forecast frequently.
It's very unlikely that any computer model snow amount forecast, especially days in advance, will be exactly right. Sometimes it's even difficult to forecast amounts the day of the event. Don't focus so much on exact numbers. Our forecast offices produce a range of possibilities available on each office's winter page.
Impacts from winter storms can vary a lot across even short distances, especially true in the terrain of the mountains, but even in areas with more subtle differences in elevation. Just because it's not bad where you are doesn't mean that it isn't bad just a short distance away.
There's often a small area, perhaps not bigger than a couple of counties, of heavy snow embedded within the larger area of precipitation. It is very difficult to pinpoint exactly where this area will occur in advance. That is why we give ranges and probabilities, and that is what we mean when we say isolated higher amounts.
Not all storms are the same. Some storms affect different areas in different ways, and even weaker storms can produce big impacts. The Winter Storm Severity Index is a product that uses threat levels to depict overall anticipated impacts to society due to winter weather.
You can be a citizen scientist. You can report the weather that is occurring at your location any time of day. Local National Weather Service forecast offices offer Skywarn Storm Spotter training, so you can become an official Skywarn Storm Spotter. The MPing app and website allows you to submit your report online. And for the most dedicated, you can join CocoRaws, where you can submit your daily precipitation report directly to the National Weather Service. Your ground truth helps us improve forecasts.
Did you know that a 1 to 2 degree temperature difference either at the surface or just a few hundred feet off the ground can make a big difference in whether we get rain, freezing rain, sleet, or snow? That's really hard to forecast when we don't have a lot of data, but thankfully we do have 92 upper air stations that release weather balloons at least twice a day.
Even if you live in warmer climates, it's important to know your winter precipitation types when traveling. Freezing rain is liquid rain that freezes when it hits the ground, creating a coat of ice on roads, walkways, trees, and power lines. Sleet is rain that freezes into ice pellets before reaching the ground.
Snow squalls are quick, intense bursts of heavy snow that are accompanied by gusty winds. They rapidly reduce visibility and can create treacherous travel. Snow squall warnings are issued for localized areas where snow squalls are expected in the next 30 to 60 minutes. As of December 2019, They are now sent as one of the wireless emergency alerts.
Know the differences between watches, warnings, and advisories. A winter storm warning means that confidence is high that a winter storm will produce heavy wintry precipitation and cause significant impacts. A winter storm watch means that confidence is medium and that a winter storm producing significant impacts is possible. A winter weather advisory means to exercise caution, as light amounts of wintry precipitation will cause slick conditions and may impact travel.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Marine forecast for the south coast, north to northwest or west-northwest winds 30 knots, seas around 20 feet. And for the north coast, westerly winds 15 to 25 knots. Central northern inside waters, looking at north winds for Monday at about 15 knots, seas 3 feet. And for Stevens Passage, winds will be out of the northwest at 20 knots with 13-foot seas. And then for Tuesday, on the south coast, west-northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, seas subsiding to 9 feet. And for the north coast, north to west winds at 15 knots. And Lynn Canal, look for northerly winds on Tuesday at 20 knots, north 15 for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, southeast winds 15 knots, seas 6 feet. Prince William Sound on Monday, winds will be out of the northwest at 20 knots, few higher gusts, and seas at about 4 feet. And for the North Gulf Coast, on the east side there, around Middleton Island, north winds 20 knots and gusts of 35 knots with 8-foot seas, and northwest winds 20 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. Gale warnings out for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay. Northwest winds 35 knots, and for Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 10 to 20 knots. And for Tuesday, Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 20 knots with 5-foot seas, and east winds 25 knots for Kamishak Bay. Prince William Sound, east winds 30 knots, seas up to 6 feet, and southeast winds 35 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. For the Barren Islands, south winds at 25 knots, western North Gulf Coast, expecting a southeast wind sustained at 25 knots. Kodiak Island, Monday, gale warnings, northwest winds 30 to 35 knots. And for the Alaska Peninsula, west winds 35 to 40 knots, and from Castle Cape to Sitkinak, northwest winds 40 knots, gust of 55 knots. Bristol Bay, northwest winds 30 knots. And even stronger winds coming in on Tuesday. Full gales for the Alaska Peninsula, southwest winds 45 knots, seas 20 to 25 feet. Bristol Bay, southwest winds 40 knots, seas around 20 feet. Kodiak Island, gale warnings, southwest winds 25 to 40 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians on Monday, gale warnings, southwest winds 35 knots, gale warnings for the central Aleutians, southwest winds 40 knots. Western Aleutians, same thing, southwest winds 40 knots, seas 16 to 17 feet. And for Tuesday, western Aleutians, west to southwest winds 30 to 35 knots. Gale warnings continue for the central Aleutians. West winds, though, 35 to 40 knots. And full gales for the eastern Aleutians. Mostly west winds at 45 knots with seas 20 to 25 feet. Pribilof Islands on Monday, southwest winds 30 knots. West winds 15 knots for the Yukon Delta coast, Norton Sound, and St. Lawrence Island. West winds 25 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta coastline, and southeast winds at 25 for St. Matthew Island. For Tuesday, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, gale warnings, east winds 40 knots. Storm warnings for the Kuskokwim Delta coast for southwest winds at 50 knots, and storm warnings for the Pribilof Islands. West winds 50 knots, seas 30 feet. And for the St. Matthew Island area, gale warnings, northwest winds 45 knots, same forecast for the Yukon Delta coast. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast for Monday, east winds 25 knots with heavy freezing spray, 6 to 7 foot seas. For the central and western Arctic coast, southeast winds 20 knots, heavy freezing spray in those areas as well with 4 to 6 foot seas. West winds 20 knots for the Chukchi Sea. And for Tuesday, small craft advisories for the Chukchi Sea, east winds 25 knots, seas 5 feet. For the western Arctic coast, southeast winds 20 knots. For the central coast, southeast at 25 knots. Small craft advisories for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east winds 25 knots, seas 5 feet. And for tonight, trough with low pressure there just west of Kivalina, and the trough extending down to another low center tracking eastward from northeast Bristol Bay into Kamishak Bay. Look for areas of precipitation along that boundary there, mostly in the form of snow to the north and inland areas. Dry central and eastern interior with cold temperatures again tonight, and the clear sky areas with the light winds. Lingering flurries there, Northway, Tok, maybe into Nebezna down to the Wrangell Mountains. And for tomorrow, warm front rains into the Pribilofs and Alaska Peninsula. Rain increases again as that low tracks in toward the central and south coast of the Panhandle. And then showers on Tuesday. Big storm comes up to the southwest coast with gale force and storm force winds, gusts 40 to 65 miles an hour with...
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.